development contributions first, which I understand is maybe the most meat of there might be the most questions about.
Kapai, Madam Chair, correct. Yes, so I want to introduce Michael Duandam. Michael is the strategic, he sits in the strategic planning area under Sean Ordain. He's the district planning manager. Michael hails from Palmerston North in the Manawatu, but he is a new resident to Wellington and a bit of an expert in these things. So we do have two parts to this briefing. The first, of course, is the development contributions, but we also have the water services bylaw. This first half will be about 30 to 40 minutes. We've got only a handful of slides, and then it's a Q&A session, really. I suppose for development contributions, we've been growing as a city quite a lot, haven't we? And we've seen the pains of growth. Development contributions, however, are not the panacea to growth and solving the problem. And this is an unusual city. We are mostly brownfield. We don't have a lot of greenfield when you compare ourselves to Kapiti and other more flatter cities. So it is a different dynamic when we talk development contributions, but Mike's here. He's going to take you through some slides and then we'll have some Q&A.
Hey, Joe, are you an author on that report?
Many thanks,
Reading.
Beth. You're just online. If you could mute your mic, that'd be great. Excellent. All right. Over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam. Kia ora koutou. The big focus of today's briefing is really going to be a bit of a development contributions, or DCs as they're known in the local government sector 101. I'll be giving you a bit of an understanding about what they are, how they're used, where they're useful and where they are less useful. And in regards to that, the second item up there, I'll be discussing greenfield versus brownfield. It is a really pertinent issue for Wellington, as Liam was alluding to. I'll also be talking to you about our current policy and how it's working in practice, revenue. I've done a bit of a comparative assessment just to help you understand how it stacks up with other cities of a similar scale and nature. And then I'll be walking you through some of the changes that are being proposed to the policy as part of the overall LTP. And then I'll cover off some next steps and maybe to help make efficient use of time, and just recognising there is another briefing afterwards, perhaps Madam Chair holding questions till the end. All right, what are development contributions? They are an infrastructure funding tool that the Local Government Act provides councils. Development contributions really work under the premise that growth pays for growth. So they have a 20-year time horizon, and this is a little bit different to what you might recognise in other parts of the LTP. So you've recently approved a budget that's got a 10-year time horizon. You also approved an infrastructure strategy and a financial strategy which have 30-year time horizons. The development contributions policy is a little bit different, so 20 years. The reason for that is that you typically have a lot of your capital spend that you'll be approving in that first 10 years. You've got a lot of certainty about that. However, you may be looking to identify things through your infrastructure strategy that may need significant investment, and that might fall in that sort of extra 10-year window. And so there's an opportunity there to put that into the development contributions policy, collect revenue for that so that you're anticipating it's going to come. There's some relative certainty about that, and then you're not foregoing the opportunity to collect some revenue by the time you deliver that infrastructure asset. It is a little bit unusual. There aren't a lot of programs that councils typically put into those 10 to 20 year windows, but there is an opportunity to do so. DCs are tied to the LTP. They work in with the financial strategy, revenue finance policy, and link into your capital works programs that you approve through your decision making on the LTP. And the DC policy provides you with the opportunity to recover some revenue for borrowings on infrastructure investment. It only relates to growth-related infrastructure, though. So this development contributions policy is being reviewed alongside the rest of the LTP. Development contributions are limited in terms of what you can collect for. So the LGA is very specific about this. It's related to transport, your three waters, reserves and community facilities. That does cover basically every aspect of council business, but there are some specific requirements around exactly what falls within a DC mix and what does not. Development contribution fees are levied based on who benefits from that. There'll be a cost for a particular piece of infrastructure, and then that gets distributed across those that benefit from that investment. So, for example, let's say, hypothetical example, a development in the north of the city, a greenfield area, say we're anticipating 2,000 new houses are going to be built in that area over the next 15 years. And say there's a roading project that's required to unlock that development opportunity. Say it's $2 million. The cost that would be distributed across each of those development, those people who would benefit from that development would be $1,000 for that transport contribution, and there'd be a similar calculation that would roll out for other assets, say for water or a local reserve. On top of that, we don't just have local catchment contributions, there's citywide contributions. So there's citywide reserves, there are major community facilities that benefit the broader community, and those can be levied across the city. So when development contribution fees are calculated, they're a combination of those which are citywide contributions and then also local catchment fees. And once again, it's based on the premise that growth pays for growth. So this is an extract from the current DC policy, so the 2021 LTP's development contributions policy, and this is an example of how that fee structure is kind of broken down. So you'll see there on the left-hand side, there are citywide contributions. That's a mix of transport and reserves and certain Three Waters assets that they have a broader network benefit and can therefore be charged across the city everywhere. And then there are some specific catchment projects as well, and those greenfield areas in particular where there are often higher fees, and that's because there needs to be a lot more investment in those places to unlock development opportunities specific to those catchments. I'm just going to give a bit of a chat now about greenfield versus brownfield growth. Now, greenfield growth is very, very easy to apply development contributions to. And the reason for that is you can draw a really clear conclusion about who's going to benefit from the investment. Often it's a one-to-one relationship. Unlike brownfield development, where development's really lumpy, we don't know, we can't predict as well where development's going to happen over time. We have to take a macro lens based on population, household projections, and then split that out across housing catchments. We can use building consents data and other proxies to help estimate what the uplift might be in certain locations, but generally it's very difficult. The other thing as well is that we often have very poor condition and capacity assessment data to inform what's actually in the pipes, for example, in some of our existing urban environment. And so it can be really difficult not just to understand what the upgrade requirements are in some of those locations, but also over what period of time would we expect that uptake to be, and then therefore how you would levy for that. So greenfield growth is a great, development contributions are a great tool for managing greenfield growth, not so much for brownfield. Moving on now to the current policy. So in the annual plan from last financial year, we recorded $4.7 million of development contributions revenue. This is actually quite low compared to some of the other centres across the country. And I've just provided a bit of an overview there on some councils. So Auckland, obviously, a significant growth engine for the country. No surprise there that that's significantly higher than anywhere else. Christchurch, similarly, a lot higher. Hamilton has a lot of greenfield growth. They've got a high population growth rate at the moment. But I guess what's surprising, coming from my old hometown, Palmerston North, actually generated higher development contributions revenue than Wellington in the last financial year. The average DC charge in Wellington is about $6,000 for a brownfield site. That's very, very low. The sector average would be between $22,000 and $24,000. Greenfield is always higher because there are immediate infrastructure requirements to turn that development opportunity online, but still quite low compared to other parts of the country. Greenfield growth in Auckland and Hamilton and others is significantly higher. We have in our current LTP, for the 2021 LTP, roughly $300 million worth of growth programs, and it's not huge again in terms of actual growth programs. And the other strange thing that I'll point out, and I'll come back to this when I talk about the policy updates that we're proposing to make, is that our non-residential activities, so our commercial activities, they're aggregated into one category. It's very normal across our local government sector to actually have those split out, and that really helps to, with that fairness argument around who benefits and then who pays. So, yeah, I'll come back to that in a future slide. So, sorry, brownfield BF, GF is greenfield. Sorry.
And EHU stands for equivalent household unit.
So why are our DCs so low? It comes back to what Liam was saying in the introduction. Our growth is largely brownfield, and so we're able to utilise a lot of our existing infrastructure, so we haven't had to invest additional infrastructure and then therefore levy those DCs. Our commercial development is also, we don't have a lot of room for big industrial developments like Auckland, Christchurch, Hamilton, etc. So a lot of those areas, and even Palmerston North, a lot of the contributions that we saw on the previous slide were related to that commercial development, and so we just don't have that because of geography. And a lot of our residential development is brownfield, and a lot of those other areas, they're greenfield. So there are higher costs, and therefore, and there's higher growth rates, and that's why you're seeing higher DC revenue generated in those other locations. It isn't necessarily because we're doing anything wrong, it's just the situation with our market and the land development opportunities that exist in Wellington City. One thing, though, is that historical LTPs haven't contained a lot of growth programs as well. And so, for instance, in the 2021 LTP, there were no growth programs for water. So when you sort of add that all up, it adds to a bigger picture. There are renewals and things like that, but growth programs on their own, that there just hasn't been a significant amount of actual growth capital programs. So moving on now to the policy and the updates. One of the things that I'd mention, it's more of a back office thing, but we've had to create a new model, and the existing one's no longer fit for purpose. So we've got a new model. We're inputting new information into that based on the decisions you made earlier in the month about the CapEx program. We are aligning the growth projections that are in the LTP with the DC policy, making sure that the demand profile is accurately reflecting what is being endorsed across the LTP. We are looking to introduce more non-residential categories. So I was just mentioning before that we've only got one non-residential category at the moment. The proposal was to split that out at this stage, looking at having an industrial category, a retail category and an office category. They've all got quite different demand profiles and infrastructure, so it's important to make sure that that's recognised. Under the current policy, there's probably a risk that there's some cross-subsidisation happening, people probably being unfairly or having to pay an unfair amount for certain developments depending on what it is. So for example, you might have a manufacturing plant and they could be using a lot of water and creating a lot of wastewater compared to someone in a retail setting that may have a very low water demand, but they're kind of treated the same. So the intention is to create a more even playing field and better reflect the demands of different activities on the network and therefore charge accordingly. So this will be a first step in disaggregating those, and future policy reviews should look at that further, but given the time that we have, it's a good first step. There are just also a number of minor updates to text that we're proposing as well. They're largely administrative in nature, but the main significant change in policy is really around that non-residential category. And then the final thing, which we're currently working on, is updating the fee schedule to reflect the capital works program that you've endorsed for inclusion in the long-term plan. That information's only just coming through based on your decisions, and once we've been able to pull that into the new model and have the inputs verified, then we'll have an updated schedule for you, hopefully in the coming week or so. So in terms of next steps, you'll be seeing the DC policy in its entirety for endorsement on the 13th of March. That'll be included alongside the rest of the LTP documentation for consultation through April and May, and then the outcomes of your deliberations in May, June will determine where the final version of the development contributions policy lands, and then from the start of the next financial year we'll be levying new DC charges based on your LTP decisions.
Yeah, I've got you, Sarah, to the list. Right, so I do have a list of questions. And first of all, before we start, just to remind people, this session is in public and live streamed, as will the other session be this afternoon. Councillor Young.
So I've got a couple of questions. First of all, with development contributions, do we have any idea of roughly what percentage they are of the cost of infrastructure to, say, a greenfields thing, or is that impossible? I mean, I know there will be different costs, but do we have a rule of thumb that they're 10% or 50% or?
I don't know what it is in the Wellington context. The Productivity Commission has done a lot of research on that in recent times, but I'd have to come back to you with some specifics. I don't have that information at hand, sorry.
Okay, well, don't lose any sleep over it, but I'd be interested. So the second one is, one of those slides you went through the various suburbs about water supply, and Kelburn was a 0. Why does Kelburn not get charged for water supply?
So
there was another suburb too, but Kelburn's in my ward.
We don't have any capital growth programs ring-fenced to that area. So there are some citywide fees. So those, I'll go back and I'll just show you on the image here. So there are no specific charges for Kelburn there for transport or parks, and that's because, and water supply, and that's because there'll be some that are captured within the citywide fees, so that's grouped with a broad range of city range. There aren't any specific water growth programs for that catchment, which is why there are no fees there.
I'm actually none the wiser.
So what?
I mean, why would you have wastewater? But I mean, sure, you have to have water coming in for water to go out.
So what
That's
these
how it works.
What this reflects is that the network in Kelburn hasn't got growth improvement projects to put in it. So when people are building in Kelburn, they're hooking to existing networks which are being funded from renewals rather than from growth.
Yeah.
So the people of Kelburn are still paying through their rates for the services, but new developments are not being charged for the improvement of the network.
Okay. By the way, where's Frobisher? I've never heard of Frobisher. Is that a suburb of?
That was new to me, Councillor, too. I was Frobisher. What? I've never heard of that.
So the next question is, if we, I mean, I can see our development contributions are low, but if we are trying to encourage people to build, is this the right time to whack up the development contributions, or is the cost of them so little in comparison to, say, steel that it doesn't really matter?
So as part of the LTP, you're required to make decisions on development contributions. It may be that you decide that as an instrument this isn't one you wish to use, but then you will have to find another way of funding those growth projects.
Oh, like increasing pool charges. No, that was a joke. So then the other thing is, you're talking about non-residential water demand, and I think it was almost the penultimate slide or something. There was non-residential water demand, and it just seemed to me that the way you were saying that non-residential isn't metered. Isn't everything metered at the moment? Everything commercially is metered? Water?
I can't answer that. I don't know if they are metered or not, but the fees themselves are linked to capital programs that council has endorsed as part of an LTP. And if there is an improvement program that will provide for more capacity, then council can use a development contributions policy to levy for that, and those developments will pay a portion of that so that council can recover the cost for that growth component.
I think I'm getting the general idea. Okay, thank you.
Councillor McNulty.
Probably too early, but given the Cabinet paper this morning, will this whole policy have to come up for significant review again in sort of next year or two? Would that be a fair guess?
Any answer we give you will be a guess.
Yeah.
As my favourite phrase this year is, the law is the law until such time as the law changes.
Yeah. How rigorous do the cost estimates need to be? I'm just thinking in terms of, let's say you want to price up the Ahariu Valley. Assumedly, you'd have to build a pretty significant amount of road, but, does that need to come down to almost a quote and costed detail? Or, how, I'm just trying to understand when you're thinking about these charges to apply, what level of specificity have you drilled down into or certainty?
So the budgets that are included in there are things that have flowed through from asset management plans through into into individual programs and projects in the LTP. What council can do and what the LGA anticipates is that as you get closer to delivery, you may have cost changes. Those costs will be updated with subsequent LTPs. And there's also the ability to change figures later on in a retrospective sense to collect backworks. So if we find that we under-collected, then we can update that as part of a policy update in the future. So there are some correction mechanisms in place that anticipate that things will change over time, and that's why typically development contributions policies will only capture the bulk of budget items in that first 10-year window, where there is greater certainty about what development opportunities may be required and what investment may be required.
Yep. And finally, what's the admin cost or time on the average $6,000 development contribution that we earn? If you had to try and quantify what are we actually spending in internal cost to get that 6K through the door?
We don't have those numbers with us, I'm afraid, Councillor.
I don't think it's high through, Madam Chair. It's once the fees are set, it's the code of compliance. Certificate of compliance is really the collection mechanism. I think there's one particular staff member who works with a small team who does the collection, but their rates that are put on as a condition of a resource consent, they're very procedural and administrative in that sense, and it's then just a matter of collecting it. Thank you.
Yeah, just on that, there are three main mechanisms for collecting development contributions. It'll either be through a resource consent, typically subdivision, a building consent, or a service connection. So at that point, the council can invoice for a development contribution. It'll be assessed against the policy. If you fall within one of those catchments, it could be 6,000, or if you're in a greenfield area, slightly higher. And then council can withhold issuing a code of compliance if they don't receive payment for a development contribution, or they can prevent a certificate of title being issued for a subdivision. So there are some belts and braces in place in the legislation to ensure that council is able to recover costs.
Right, I have myself next on the list, and my question, I've got two. The first one was, there was another slide which had something about growth largely using existing infrastructure. And I guess I just wanted to, maybe it was the next one. No, that one, growth largely accommodating using existing infrastructure. And I guess I just wanted to test whether that, how much that is actually true, and if any of our issues to do with the problems with existing infrastructure have been that we haven't, adequately provided for the growth, given that we're largely a brownfield kind of development city. Do you see what I'm asking? Sorry, it's kind of more a general question, but I guess I just want to test that point, and if that's been one of the problems with our existing policy.
So one of the challenges is we do have networks in the city that that are at capacity. That's why Taranaki Street's being dug up, for example. And so the ability to squeeze intensification into existing networks is becoming a limiting factor in parts of the city. The challenge comes when it comes to the renewal of that infrastructure, and that when we were to replace it with something larger, a portion of that can be charged through development contributions, but not all of it, because of the servicing of existing development. So what we can't do is use DCs to repair existing infrastructure solely for the use of existing development.
And just to follow on from that, do we sort of feel that we're getting that, we're looking at that balance to make sure that we get it more? Because, one of the things we hear from existing residents is, scared about growth because of the strain on infrastructure that's existing.
I think, Sean, I'll have a go. You can chip in if you like. I think we're maturing.
Okay, good.
I think, look, I cut my teeth in greenfield planning in Melbourne in the southeast, and as Michael's indicated, it is almost wholly funded by growth in a greenfield context. Here it's more difficult. Just from the collection amounts you've seen that Michael's presented to you indicates, given the size of our normal CapEx budget through the year, it's not a big player in the finances of the city traditionally. But as we move towards focusing on MRT corridor, Adelaide Road, in particular, Kent and Cambridge, those are the areas we need to focus on in detail and from an urban planning perspective, and make sure that when that growth does occur, and it will, whether it's light rail or another form of mass rapid transit, we need to be on top of the growth infrastructure investment that is required, and therefore charging accordingly. So I think we're maturing. It's probably what I'd say. I'm happy to, Sean, if you can dovetail in there.
Yes, I could also refer you to the underground digital twin work, which is measuring what's beneath our streets and massively improving our knowledge of that critical infrastructure that binds our city together. And one of the key things with that, alongside the work on condition and growth studies that Wellington Water are doing, is reducing our levels of uncertainty about what's under the ground and how it will serve as the skeleton of our future city.
Thank you. And my final question, which is a little bit, it's sort of not quite directly related to this, but I have been getting a lot of questions about greenfields generally, and just after some kind of very top-level kind of advice, my understanding is that, while there are greenfields coming in the district plan, that there is not a lot of capacity in Wellington City, and is still that the advice of staff, there's not a lot of developable greenfields available to us in the city limits.
Yes, the district plan identifies greenfield areas in the north. But unlike comparator cities like Christchurch and Wellington, we are broken into a number of local authorities across the metropolis. And in those edge areas that are bearing a lot of the growth in places like Christchurch and Auckland, those are outside of our city boundaries and so do not count towards our totals.
Councillor Free.
Yeah, my question was, when it comes to infrastructure like Omaruru, which we put in advance of to anticipate growth, how do we make sure that the growth that arrives contributes to that? And I will add another small question after that.
Great question. When an asset is developed and it returns a level of service, there's a percentage of the value of that asset that is funded directly through rates. Where Omaruru, which is a great example, there is a percentage of that volume that's provided for that growth. That percentage, as Sean mentioned earlier on, is transferred over to the DC's policy so that as people develop those equivalent housing units, it's charged under the DC's policy. So although it's one asset, the way that it's funded is split dependent on the benefits going to provide.
Yes, I'm coming from a point where I don't think we're actually charging enough. And I don't think it's a limiting factor for housing either. But how do we, so we put in an asset, there's always an ongoing OPEX that goes with the CAPEX. Do we actually factor that into what we charge in our DCs?
No, DCs is for the recovery of the CAPEX investment.
Only CAPEX, okay. Thank you.
The only exception to that would be where council has made a conscious decision to capitalise the operational expenditure, and I think there may have been some recent calls about that on some activity areas for the council, particularly around transport-related programs. But that would have to be a specific decision.
Yeah, I guess I'd be interested in seeing if we could look at that. Thank you.
Councillor Chung.
Thanks very much. I'm trying to understand the relationship between DC and the things that we actually do. Now, for example, we're looking at transport, parks and reserves. When you look at a particular area and the transport needs to be improved to cope with the additional houses that go in there, does that actually come out of the contributions, or is that budgeted for before, and any income from the DC just goes to help that? Because it seems like the amounts that we get from DC is very, very low, so it could hardly be considered.
So what you would do is, we'll use it. I'll make up an example. So it's entirely fictional before anyone gets excited. So say we were going to relieve congestion between Karori and Brooklyn by building a road along the fence line of Zealandia. If that was to cost $100 million, we would put the $100 million through this LTP process into those lists of CapEx projects that Michael was referring to earlier, and then that would form the denominator in your equation we were showing you, and we would start to collect against that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and second part of my question is for Karori, we know that Karori is very, very short on water supply, and so would the development contributions not be a lot greater for any expansion up there? Because there is a lot of area, and I don't know where you call it, greenfields or brownfields in Karori, where you can actually develop, further up the hill, but you can't because the infrastructure isn't there. Would that not be higher?
You would need to have infrastructure projects which were then entered into the schedules to then charge them. So you can't just say, I think there might be some growth in Karori one day, we should just collect money now. You have to have a growth program put through the schedules of the infrastructure strategy of the LTP and then collect against those.
Oh, I see. Yep. Okay.
And sorry, through you, Madam Chair, and just to be clear as well, I mean, there's instances in particular, this current legislation, where if you haven't spent the money on that infrastructure project, you're obliged to reimburse people who have contributed. So you've got to be very sure that that project's going to be delivered, or else you'll be giving money back.
Great, thank you.
Deputy Mayor Foon.
Yeah, and this might be in the same vein as some of Councillor Matthews, but really, just last year we spent a lot of time, obviously, on the district plan and let's get Welly moving in terms of MRT down the number one route. So, was it a timing issue that we weren't charging for growth at that point, or?
So had you reached the business case stage and had that accepted, then you would have had the products in order to enter it into the system. But as it stands, we didn't have the level of certainty,
right.
Which is also why it wasn't listed as a mass rapid transit system for the NPSUD's purposes in the district plan.
Very frustrating. Okay, next one was just to get examples. So in Newtown, we have had a lot of development. So have we been charging for growth, for renewals, for water in that instance?
I don't know the specifics for Newtown, but assuming that there were capital growth programs that were captured within the long-term plan, then yes, they would have. But yeah, I'd have to go back and check whether there were any capital growth programs that the DC policy was able to leverage off.
Yeah. Okay.
Councillor Brown.
I just want to explore the relationship between growth and charges. So let's say, for argument's sake, that under the existing district plan, there's relatively modest potential growth in, say, Mount Victoria. And so therefore there's no plans to actually increase infrastructure for Mount Victoria. So there's no development charges a la what you had for Kelvin. And let's say that when we have a new district plan, it allows, say, an extra 1,000 residents into Mount Victoria, and let's say that we assume that that would actually require $10 million of investment in three water type infrastructure. So once we allowed the district plan to actually enable that sort of population increase, and we had a plan to actually provide additional infrastructure, the third step would be that we would then say, okay, $10 million divided by 1,000, it's $10,000 per house is now going to, you guys, that's what you're going to pay. Is that how the sort of sequencing actually works in these things?
Yes, in practice.
And is it always like a lump sum up front? So we have no capacity to say we'll charge you $1,000 a year over, put it on the rate, so to speak. It has to be an upfront charge?
Yes, that's how the LGA assumes it will work. And the reason for that is it would be very administratively difficult to split that up. We only really have one opportunity to collect, and it's either at that code of compliance certificate stage for a building consent, a service connection, or a subdivision consent, and we wouldn't have any other decent mechanisms to be able to recover that cost if it was split out over time, so it needs to be paid up front.
So under the current policy, we have a postponement. We have a postponement scheme under the current policy, but that applies to DC over 50,000 grand. Right. If you apply, and the council can follow the procedure to prove it, so mostly related to those mom-and-dad developers.
Gotcha. So just coming back onto my first question about the district plan population increase, infrastructure requirements. So do we actually have those? I mean, can I look it up today and find out exactly what those sort of forecasts of additional infrastructure requirements are for the densification? I mean, is there a kind of an actual piece of paper that I can see where the additional infrastructure is going to be required to allow the population densification that the district plan is going to allow?
The best information available would be from the spatial plan, but that doesn't necessarily reflect where everything has headed with the proposed district plan. The reality is that council will have to respond to that in a reactive way post decisions on the proposed district plan, and then investment plans will need to be put in place to realise the development capacity opportunities that the district plan will provide for. The RMA, it's a bit of a quirk now. The MDRS planning process that the PDP has put in place is not what you would have to do with a greenfield development area. The RMA now assumes that councils will proactively plan and enable growth and sequence infrastructure and land use planning together. But the MDRS implementation means that we are forced into a reactive response. And so updated spatial planning would be a useful tool to inform the next LTP so that timing, sequencing, prioritisation of investment could be done in a way to match demand as best as possible.
Councillor Randall.
I remember a piece of advice a developer gave me when I first became a councillor, which is that when they're looking at an area suggested for development, the first thing they look at is the current and future three waters plan. So my first question is, there's the current three waters plan that you can go and look up, but with the changes outlined in the proposed district plan, when they're confirmed, will that then have a consequential update to the Three Waters infrastructure plan and potentially would add additional growth projects?
So yes, once the district plan is confirmed, then most plans and most infrastructure classes will then need to be updated, so electricity's in the same boat. The difficulty is, until the certainty of the land regulation is set, the utilities don't want to provide advice because it's difficult to compute the models, but it's difficult to then set the land use plans without the utility. So essentially, at some point, we need to break the cycle.
Yeah, I think, Madam Chair, it's also fair to say, Sean, isn't it, that when we cut the first draft of the spatial plan, we started talking to Wellington Water and Wellington Electricity, all the utilities really, to give them a heads up about the decisions council had made around the metropolitan limits of the city and the confined greenfield areas, but the desire for the city to densify along main transport corridors. And that approach back in, was when I started in 2021, kicked off a whole lot of series of discussions around Wellington Electricity, water utilities, and social and community infrastructure as well, with some of the ministries about where they need to start thinking about growth. And the recent reports we've received from Wellington Water are an example of that work that was kicked off 2 or 3 years ago, when they're starting to provide more granular information around where growth is going to occur based on the guidance and steps that the spatial plan and then the district plan went and started to refine further. So in that sense, we're getting, as I say, maturing, but we're getting to a better picture about what we're going to need to invest in the future to cater for the growth of the city.
Okay. It's when you have greenfields growth, though, you're outlining that the development contributions generally cover all of the infrastructure costs of a genuinely new greenfields area, and so expanding to greenfields doesn't really come at the cost to the ratepayer.
In a general sense, yes. They still have to connect into something. They don't exist in isolation. So there are still networks. There's integrated networks that they have to connect into. So tends to be a one-to-one relationship.
Yeah. But they also have a city contribution element to it as well, which helps, I guess, is towards that.
That's right. I think, Madam Chair, so Councillor Randall, your ward, for example, has an existing growth area that is expanding, say. There's community infrastructure that's been built into that growth area. The cost will be shared by the new growth as well as the existing ratepayers, because they've done their bit. They've effectively possibly even priced in their contribution when they bought their lot and built their house, and they've priced in their contribution as they've paid rates. But that additional growth area that will be bolted on, if you like, will also help to recycle and pay for those community assets over time.
Yeah. Does that cover an additional big haul for Churton Park?
Well, I was indicating there's some, obviously the North Ward councils have some particular interest in certain infrastructure investment, and that's a good example of what could be.
Just one more question. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sorry, just on your last question, it's important to remember this is a recovery mechanism. So you still have to pay up front, and that can still have a rates impact until such time as the money is recovered.
Okay, fair enough.
Quickly,
just the previous slide. One before, one with the suburbs on it. So my last question is it possible if you look at a catchment for a development contribution, let's say Johnsonville Onslow, can you just go and ask the council saying, well, these are my contributions to water supply and that sort of thing? What are the growth projects that are connected to that? Can you just go and find that out?
Yes, the LGA requires council to show a causal relationship between the projects that have been included in an LTP and where they end up in a fee structure. So yes is the answer.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got 2 more people on the list, and then we'll need to move on to the second item. So, Councillor Pannett.
Do you get any complaints from developers about our charges?
No.
Right, so Jess...
But of course,
capacity then.
Well, of course not, because given the data we've presented today. But of course, they're sensitive to pricing, and it is a very expensive city to develop, mostly due to the seismic challenges, as you know, Councillor. So, no, nothing that I've heard in my time here of the excessive fees in DCs.
Just in terms of possibly raising the DCs as we prepare for climate change and as we get more scientific information about seismic risk. Is that possible when we say that this infrastructure is needed, like we want a lot more green infrastructure? Are we able to sort of demand that it's done?
So you can...
So in other words, if you want a new suburb, not that greenfields are great, but if you want a new suburb with lots and lots of green infrastructure, are we able to make sure that happens?
Well,
it's a bit far away.
you would effectively be building the infrastructure through your schedule of capital investments, and therefore through your local government act decision-making powers, you do it that way and then recover using this mechanism.
Okay, and obviously we can't exceed the RMA and Building Act, but nevertheless, hopefully that will change. And just the last question. So you had a slide saying, or maybe earlier on, about why our charges aren't that high. So just about the greenfields, so that means that even in the best circumstances, developers will decide what land to make available. And is it quite problematic, particularly in terms of the north, that the calendars control so much of the land out there? Should they be able to drip feed land into the market, in other words?
I'm not going to pass judgment on the calendars other than to say they're rational people who will respond to rational systems like anybody else.
Councillor-elect Rogers.
Kia ora, thank you very much for that. I was interested to know what sort of values led to reiterating the model and sort of what guided your changes to that model and perhaps what benefits we might see from that. The benefits will largely be administrative. To be honest, the current model became unworkable because there was just a decade plus of inputs that had got into there and it just wasn't operating efficiently. It really is it's a back office sort of thing. It will deliver the outputs that are defendable, which is useful if we ever get challenged through a DC challenge. And there'll be some operational efficiencies by having that new model. And one more question, if I may. Just with the way that you're calculating those, or how the contributions are split amongst the housing units, how flexible is that new model to changes in demand, say, when it's kind of, I guess, uncertain at this point how permissive the plan would be around brownfield versus greenfield? And so I guess how equally it could change the demand that there is given the supply change. So the way that the model works is it will take the LTP population household projections as the demand input, and so that underpins all of the long-term plan. So it's a simple input-output model, so very easy to update that, and that'll continue to be updated with subsequent LTPs. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you both. We now need to quickly rush through the second part of this workshop, the Water Services Bylaw Review. No mai, Jeff and Charlotte. And I don't know.
I don't know either. I think it's Jeff, Zach.
Oh, Zach, sorry, yes. So yeah, we have 10 minutes. Boom.
Thank you, councillors. I just want to introduce Charlotte first. Charlotte joined us mid last year from Wakatani District Council, and is working on this. So she'll briefly introduce this, or between the two of us, and then we'll open for questions.
Kia ora, councillors. We're here today to talk about the Water Services Bylaw Review. There's a paper on the agenda for this Thursday's meeting, so this is some information for you. Our first slide, what is the Water Services Bylaw? It's a regulatory tool and it aren't covered in other legislation, including requirements or regulations for things like connections to the public water supply, different types of water supply, ownership and maintenance responsibilities between the customer and the council, compliance with water restrictions to manage demand or during an emergency, fire protection connections to the public water supply, backflow prevention, water meters and flow restrictors, and requirements for working around buried services. So that's what the current bylaw covers.
Great, and the question was, why is it coming to you now, and why is it coming to the council meeting? We agreed to, hindsight's a wonderful thing, we agreed to postpone the review of this a couple of years ago because it was caught up in the regulatory reform, which obviously is a bit of a moving feast, and that's, obviously that's an ongoing discussion with central government. That we do need to ensure it remains current. We have to review it for it to remain current this year. It has to be done by August. We have no council meetings in July and August, so we have to have it completed by June. So that's why it's coming to you now, so we can get this process through. It's a little, so we haven't tried to do a, we'll talk about what's changing. That's next. We expect that with the changes, we may need to come back with a further review in the near future once we get a bit more certainty around the direction. And including things like wastewater and stormwater, we may want to come back on those things in the near future.
So I'll quickly just talk about what we're proposing in the draft bylaw. As Jeff has said, we're proposing to retain most of the current bylaw. It's working well and it continues to be required. However, we have identified some necessary updates that should be made now. Under sort of 5 key proposals, we've grouped those under. The first being to better protect public water services infrastructure. Secondly, to better align water services regulation across the region, the Wellington region. And thirdly, to reflect changes to legislative responsibilities since Taumata Arawai, the Regulator for Drinking Water, and the Water Services Act have been introduced. We're also proposing to make some updates to definitions through the bylaw, improving some areas for readability and clarity and so on. And we're also looking at pulling it out. It's currently part of the consolidated bylaw, and we're looking at pulling it out of the consolidated bylaw to just be a standalone bylaw. So those are the key proposed changes.
And I think so people will be able to have their say like they always do with our submissions process, and we have a timeline which gets us through so that it becomes into force in the 1st of August. So, any questions?
Yes, so I had one, which was just given this changing sort of regulatory framework, would we describe this as quite a sort of a minimalist approach to the bylaw, given that we might need to do it again quite quickly?
Yes, I'd say that's fair. It's pulling in what we know at the moment, as far as we know it. But yes, it is. It's retaining it, making sure it gets across the line, but making those necessary changes for now. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Councillor Free.
So this is pretty topical, just given, the thing about the fluoride again. How much can we actually control through this bylaw, and how much are we working regionally and with the regional council to ensure, water standards? Or is this just about the infrastructure that we control?
If I can answer that, please. This is primarily about the protection of the physical assets and the connections to the Three Waters network to make sure, for example, that there is sufficient capacity. So, for example, the councillors, you've been discussing the proposed district plan, and in that district plan you've referenced a tool called the Regional Standard for Water Services. That's all about making sure that when we're allowing for growth, as we were talking about earlier on, that there is adequate capacity in that. What this tool does is says, in connecting to that capacity, that available capacity, you must connect in this way that is competent, durable, protected from, misstrikes from other developers, punching through the assets. So this is really very asset-centric. Your district plan deals with capacity, and the water quality aspect that you've asked about really comes back to the new introduction of Taumata Arawai, which is the drinking water regulator. And that's the one which sits over actually both of these aspects to make sure, for example, that we have water safety plans going forward to invest adequately in chlorine, fluoridation, public health, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a different mechanism now.
Thank you, that is helpful.
Councillor Chung.
Okay, I think you've possibly answered some of my question. So this is to do with the assets such as in the pipes, and so does this have any effect on or any relationship to what Wellington Water does, because they just control the flow of the water and not the assets themselves, don't they? Is that correct?
In response, Madam Chair, this does relate closely to Wellington Water's advice. If I can paint this as a picture that I'm developing a piece of land, I'm increasing the density of that land, putting 2 houses on there, and I want to connect to it. This ensures that where the developer is able to put their foundations in proximity to existing assets allows for safety distance so that asset can be renewed in the future. For example, we need to dig a trench. Now, Wellington Water and its role and the developer community and with our consenting teams have a standard that this refers to, whereby we all work to that particular standard. This gives effect to that standard, and it's called the Regional Standard for Water Services. So Wellington Water are the ones who advise on subdivision consents or building consents, etc., and this gives them the power to provide advice against that standard on those consent applications to make sure that we've got a durable, sustainable network into the future. So yes, it actually is very much tied to what they do and this particular standard that's referenced by this bylaw.
Okay, at the moment, anyone doing any development, building a, say, if they demolish one house and then put up a number of townhouses, at the moment, what they have to do is they have to actually put in holding tanks because the drainage capacity isn't there or isn't great enough to actually accept the drainage out of all those houses at the same time. So it goes into a holding tank. So does that come in under this bylaw, or is that a Wellington Water situation?
So I'll just go back to my earlier answer. So in the district plan, you've referenced the regional standard, and the aspect of the regional standard for water services that you've referenced there is all about capacity. So what you're talking there is about, water in, water out capacity and the need to, in your case, you were talking about attenuating that capacity for a time. So the district plan says that as a developer, you need to make sure there is capacity. And if there isn't capacity and you are developing before that network is upgraded, you might need to have an interim solution, which is a localized solution until the wider network is upgraded, because sometimes the developer will want to go in an area that suits them, and we may have a growth plan that's maybe 5 or 10 years out. And that's a situation where, as an interim, that sort of a temporary or holding tank might be needed if the developer is leading before our network is expanded for growth.
Great.
Quick one from Deputy Mayor Foon, and then we will take a quick break before our next workshop.
It will be quick.
Thank you.
So my question really is, are there any shocks or surprises for the developer community in this paper, or is it just that we're giving effect to, as you said, standards that we're already working to?
Good question. It's the one we worry about. So I've mentioned this regional standard a number of times. The regional standard is something which is iterative. It's existed for over a decade, and it used to be a standard within the council as part of its subdivision standard. The regular annual or biannual updates to that standard is one which is done in collaboration with the developers outside of this. So this just gives effect to it. And council officers and we all work together to make sure that prudent and sensible clauses or inclusions or things are taken away from that standard. So the standard itself is not new. This just gives a stronger relationship with that, and it's more about the protection of our asset. There's more strength to, and I think protecting our assets is a pretty good thing to do when it comes to Three Waters. Yeah, good.
Thank you very much, team, for such a shortened and welcome to council, Charlotte. Thank you. All right, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back to the next session.